Good morning. I'm Reverend Michelle Scott Huffman. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the minister here at First UU. First, let me wish a happy Mother's Day to my own mother, who may or may not be watching on Facebook, and offer Mother's Day blessings to all of you who are mothers, who have stood by or stood in for a mother, who hope to someday be a mother, who have a difficult relationship with a mother or with motherhood. Like every day that some celebrate and others dread, there is much wrapped up in this day and its meanings for us. But right now, I celebrate each of you, that someone brought you into this world and that by some inexplicable grace, you are here today. And finally, to those who are choosing the brave space of living and parenting outside gender binaries and norms, I see you and I celebrate you. I could tell you a story about how this, my 21st Mother's Day as a person parenting young humans, began with me marveling at the amount of standing water in the basement of a fraternity house for which I'm responsible, and waiting on the porch for the on-call plumber at 1 a.m., having a delightful conversation with a young man who is considering adding a religious studies minor and discerning a call to ministry. That's a story for a different day, though, especially since today's message was already written at 1 a.m. today. But I add this to say that there are stories all around us, just waiting to be drawn out and heard. They're stories of hope and despair, stories that help the teller sort out the details and their meanings, and stories that help us find our connections to each other, like mine to the young man asking many of the same questions I asked decades ago. One of my favorite things in the history of things is the story collection sharing an archival project called StoryCorps. If you're an NPR listener, which I know many of you are, you've probably heard these short personal stories air at some point. They debuted in 2005 on Morning Edition. I'm fascinated by them, by the ones that are a single person telling a story, by those that feature two people talking to one another, and those that are in interview format. I just love to listen to people's stories. It's like their stories are some sort of fuel that starts up both my mind and my heart. So the first time I heard a StoryCorps segment, I was hooked. On their website, StoryCorps describes their mission as to preserve and share humanity's stories in order to build connections between people and create a more just and compassionate world. Further, they write, we do this to remind one another of our shared humanity, to strengthen and build the connections between people, to teach the value of listening, and to weave into the fabric of our culture the understanding that everyone's story matters. At the same time, we are creating an invaluable archive for future generations. Just think about the way you feel when you discover some piece of your own family history, some story of a famous ancestor, or even the grief or anger you may have felt when you first discovered some unsettling truth, like a connection to organized crime or that there were slaveholders among your ancestors, as is the case for many of us who are white. And as you think about the stories that have become part of your understanding of yourself and possibly have moved you to action to begin to attempt to set right what those before you got wrong, ask yourself if you are telling your stories in a way that future generations will be able to access them, to know who you were and what you stood for. And when I say future generations, that isn't necessarily just children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. You may not have children at all, but there are generations that will follow you in your community organizations, in your professional and educational settings, even in this church community. I'm so thankful for the way that many stories of this church community have been shared and preserved. And I think there are so many more that have yet to be spoken, heard, and recorded. I hope to hear many of those in this month with its story theme, and in the coming months as we work together to imagine who and what our current context is calling us to become. Some of you may have a story from yesterday. If you participated in the Springfield observance of the John Lewis Voter Rights Advancement Action Day, If so, you may have noted that your participation in this event has connected you somehow to the story of the Honorable late John Lewis, who shared one of his personal stories on StoryCorps on February 20th, 2018. In an interview with Valerie Jackson, he shared the story of being a little boy from Troy, Alabama, who just wanted to be a preacher. He would show up to school in his tie and jacket, and his classmates and teachers would call him Boy Preacher. And knowing how badly he wanted to speak to the world, his teacher would tell him to just read and read and read. And Lewis says, I tried to read everything. We were too poor to have a subscription to the local newspaper, but my grandfather had one. And when he was finished reading his newspaper each day, he would pass it on to us to read. And one day I heard about Rosa Parks. And the action of Rosa Parks and the words of Dr. King inspired me. So John Lewis wrote Dr. King a letter. And to his surprise, he got a letter back. Dr. King sent him a bus ticket. So at the age of 18 in 1958, he took a bus to Montgomery and became a part of a movement. Lewis says we were arrested, we were jailed, we were beaten, but I guess in the end, we knew and realized that we changed things. My philosophy is very simple. When you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, you have to stand up. You have to say something. You have to do something. John Lewis followed a path, and I'm incredibly grateful that he did. It was a path through his own story to shared values that he identified with people like Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And those shared values led to collective action, the kind of action that John Lewis has famously called good trouble. And it makes me wonder what kind of action, what kind of synergy, what kind of magic might happen if we're more intentional about telling our own stories in ways that invite others to identify shared values, more intentional about listening to the stories of others in ways that helps draw out our own connections to what they have experienced or are passionate about. Marshall Gans talks about this in terms of story of self, story of us, and story of now. You've probably heard me talk about this before, and I'm certain you will again, because it's a simple and powerful formula for learning to tell our stories in ways that join us together in movements for justice, peace, and equity. Gans writes, story of self communicates the values that move us to lead. Story of us communicates values shared by those whom you hope to motivate to join us. And a story of now communicates the urgent challenge to those values that demands action now. Participating in social action not only involves a re-articulating of one's story of self, us, and now, but also marks an entry into a world of uncertainty so daunting that access to sources of hope is essential. Many of us have experienced uncertainty over this last year. Some of us like never before in our lives, and it's true, like Gans says, that access to sources of hope is essential. What if someone else's source of hope is lying dormant inside us as a story untold? What if we struggle to see hope ourselves because we haven't been able to see or hear enough stories of people who look like us, feel like us, love like us, who have been through what we are going through and have made it to the other side? What if a path to powerful, transformative, collective action lies just below the surface, waiting to be discovered as we share our lives, our experiences, our values with one another? Mobilizing ourselves and others to achieve purpose under conditions of uncertainty, which Gans says is what leaders do, challenges the hands, the head, and the heart. When I read those words, I immediately grinned at the shared values already discovered. After all, many of us have recited, we are Unitarian Universalists, with minds that think, hearts that love, and hands that are ready to serve. But sometimes we get on autopilot and we engage only the hands, heart, or head at any given time, doing our best to silo those parts of ourselves so things don't get messy. Story or narrative is a way of pulling them all back together again to work in harmony. Gans writes, narratives thus become sources of learning not only for the head, but also for the heart. Public narrative links the three elements of self, us, and now. Why am I called? Why are we called? And why are we called to act now? Far from new, this framework was articulated by the first century Jerusalem sage, Rabbi Hillel, who in the wisdom of the fathers asks, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am for myself alone, what am I? And if not now, when? As I mentioned a few weeks ago in the context of collective becoming, if we understand our values and principles as the why, then we can easier discern the how and the what of our becoming together. Again, I turn to Marshall Gans, who says that when we consider action in the face of adversity or uncertainty, we ask ourselves three questions: why we must act, how we can act, and what we must learn to do. Creative analytic thinking can help us answer the how question. How do we use resources efficiently to identify needs and detect opportunities? We may need to learn new skills to answer the what question. But to answer the why question, why does it matter? Why do we care? Why must we risk action? We turn to narrative. So friends, in this month that we focus on story, I encourage you to dig inside for yours, to remember, to review them for their meaning in your life, and to share them. Because you don't know who needs to hear them, to make a connection to their own story, to find hope, and to be moved to collective action based on shared values. Not all of our stories are happy and fun. Some of them contain great difficulty, deep loss, and even some regret. Tell those stories too, when you can, because the speaking of them gives power and healing to the speaker, and because someone else is struggling with that very thing and is just now looking for signs of hope. As we share our stories together, may we stay open to the ways that our shared values rise to the surface and walk together the path to powerful, transformative collective action that involves our minds, our hearts, and our hands. And may that path lead us to greater welcome, deeper inclusion, higher purpose, and an abundance of justice for all. Blessed be, and amen.